So welcome to our training brought to you by the Arizona Trauma Institute. I'd like to welcome you and for being a part of this. We have a live audience as well as a video audience that will be watching this recording, and I welcome all of you. I'm Dr. Roderick Logan, senior faculty member here at the Institute, and it is my privilege to bring the training today, Driving Out Stress, Overcoming Compassion Fatigue with Professional Resiliency. And this is a work that I've been a part of now for quite some time, since the very early 1980s, in one way or another, working with men and women and organizational leaders to reduce stress and to improve and transform in a positive way their work environment and their work experience. And so we're going to be looking today at several ideas, and in a moment we're going to look at our objectives and what we hope to achieve today. But to begin with, I'd like to start with a demonstration. So I have in my hand a bottle of water, and it's just an average bottle of water. There's nothing particularly different or unique about this bottle of water. But it is a bottle, and it does contain water, and I've just removed the cap. So here's my question. Why is there water on the floor? Why is there water on the floor? Any guesses?
It was shook.
Because there was a shaking? All right, thank you for playing. Wrong. We're going to make this fun, aren't we? Why is there water on the floor?
Because you took the cap off and let it go on the floor.
I took the cap off and I allowed the water to go on the floor. Wonderful answer. Wrong. Thank you for playing. Isn't this much fun?
You shook a full bottle of water.
I shook a full bottle of water. And Lou, that's a great answer, but again, it's wrong. We might think of a lot of reasons why there might be water on the floor. We could think that maybe there's water on the floor because of gravity. And as already has been said, because I took the cap off or because there's a shaking. But here's what we know that is universally true. The reason why there's now water on the floor is because there was water in the bottle. And I want you to reflect on that for just a moment as a metaphor, as an example of what we're going to be talking about today in terms of stress, body arousal, compassion fatigue. And what I'd like to suggest to all of us is that the shaking is not abnormal. It is the normal part of life and the work experience. The shaking is normal. And the reason why there is water spilling out onto the floor from the bottle has less to do with the shaking, and it has much more to do with there's water in the bottle. Now, if we compare this, a bottle that's now only nearly full, as a moment ago it was completely full of water, if we compare that to this bottle where the water level is not at filled, but much lower. And it might be difficult to appreciate that on the video or even in the audience because the water is kind of clear and difficult to see. So I'm pointing out that the water level is here. And when this bottle of water experiences the very same shaking, there's little to no water that spills out. So in this demonstration today, we're creating an awareness and a context that the water level is kind of representative of the level of stress, and in some situations, toxic stress or compassion fatigue, either in the workplace or even in our own personal life. And our goal today, and the goal that's a part of our mission for the work that we do and for the people for whom we serve, is not about getting the shaking to stop. because that's not something that's within our reach. So overcoming compassion fatigue with professional resiliency is not about stopping the triggers, stopping the shaking, or somehow magically changing our work environment to be ideal. But in fact, we're overcoming compassion fatigue with our own personal, professional resiliency, which in fact lowers our stress levels, lowers our toxicity, so that we have a lower threshold and an optimum range for tolerating changes in the environment. Because one of the things we've learned in previous trainings about the science, the physiology, and the neurology of trauma is that trauma is created when the body is pushed to a point that it has to adapt or mitigate because the environment, the outer environment, is changing more than an individual's inner environment can manage or keep up with. Which brings a sense of being overwhelmed, powerless, and that raises the threshold. In other words, it raises the level of the water in the bottle from, instead of being optimally low, to being near maximum, which means we have a less capacity to endure the shaking without spilling over the edge. And so the training today and the information we're going to be looking at is how we can begin to understand the impact of this stress and the impact when our body is aroused, and how we can begin some initiatives for overcoming compassion fatigue through resiliency. And so we also hope today to understand what resiliency is and what it isn't. So let's look at 5 particular objectives for our time together today. Objective number 1, to examine the impact and stress, to examine the impact of stress and body arousal on one's ability to effectively communicate and maintain meaningful relationships, both personally and professionally. So again, one of the things we learned from the science of trauma, not just what happens to a person, but how their body reacts to what happens to them. That with the stress comes body arousal. And as the body is aroused, a lot of our capacity, particularly areas in our prefrontal cortex with executive functioning, sequential memory, the ability to self-reflect so that we can self-evaluate and self-determine, to be proactive, to be able to see beyond the immediate moment, to see a little ways into the future, to see the consequences of choices and behaviors, those critical capacities for human beings becomes reduced as the body's stress level rises. Again, losing our capacity to be as tolerant as we would like to be when there's a shaking. And so today we're going to be looking at how stress and body arousal begins to negatively impact our ability to communicate, to deliver the message that we want to deliver, and to represent ourselves and even our own identity in the workplace that we would like, and how that also impacts then our relationships with one another. Objective number 2 is to understand the spiral of mistrust. And we're going to spend a bit of time looking at in the workplace what the spiral of mistrust is about, and learning how that spiral condition is acquired and then transmitted in the workplace, and its tendencies when we leave that unresolved. Objective number 3 is to uncover the prevailing preconceived notions. What does that sound like? A preconceived notion. Is there another word that might come to mind?
Assumptions.
Assumptions. Absolutely. Is there another word perhaps? Maybe the word judgment? Prejudgment? Reactivity? So our objective here today is to uncover the prevailing perceived notions. In other words, there might be in place, in the workplace, preconceived notions or prejudgments on the parts of both management and employees. And we hope to appreciate how those preconceived notions are undermining organizational values and our ability, even our organization's ability, to fulfill its mission. And then number 4, our objective is to identify when these issues are not addressed, when we do not resolve compassion fatigue or lower the threshold for tolerating stress, then stress and compassion fatigue become major issues because of things that are lost. So we hope to identify maybe not all, but many of the important factors in the workplace that are lost when we fail as an organization to address this issue. And then finally, number 5, and this is really the culminating point, and this speaks directly to my hope as a presenter for all of us. Not just for you who are participating, but I'm including myself because I feel like I'm still on this growth continuum personally in my life as well as professionally, that we will look at 10 core initiatives that we can begin implementing the moment we walk out of here. How we can become very pragmatic and practical in the workplace and how we begin to respond relationally to one another. And we're going to look at how these 10 initiatives can help us to reduce stress and compassion fatigue in the workplace. So let's create a context for how we're going to move forward here. And I would first like to address some ideas that are surrounding what I call the myth of fear in the workplace. And there's this idea of the unspoken notion. And here's in general what this unspoken notion is often how it's stated. Fear is good. So think about that. And as you reflect on the statement, reflect in terms of your personal work experience and the work environment that you've had, or various, for some of you, various environments that you've worked in. Have you experienced this idea, and it's kind of an unspoken notion, that fear is good? A certain level of fear in the workplace is beneficial. And in truth, and from research, we've learned that many organizational leaders have this belief that they hold to. This is a concept or a belief that either in their education or their own work experience or how they were trained and mentored by another individual, they've come to have this idea that fear is good and that it has a benefit. I was talking not too long ago to an organizational leader who was newly placed in a local office that had probably 50 employees. And this manager or supervisor of this organization in its local offices was replacing a leader who had not met the metrics of the organization and had been released and now replaced with this new player. And I had this conversation with this leader, and he said to me, I called my first meeting, and I knew that we had to shake things up. So I looked at everyone at the meeting, and there was close to 50 employees. And his opening statement, it's the first words out of his mouth, were these words: in 60 days, only 49 of you will be here. You get to decide who that is. Now think about that for a moment in terms of this idea of leadership and this prevailing myth that fear is good. And this was an idea that this organizational leader held on to. And sure enough, in 60 days, the staff was reduced from 50 to 49. And it was totally based upon a pressure moment and how people could perform under that pressure. It was his way of shaking things up. So if we come back to this idea that the shaking is the normal part of life and in the workplace, the shaking is the normal. But what is our range of tolerance for the shaking? And in this organizational's point of view, this leader's point of view, his idea was not so much about reducing the stress, but in fact increasing the stress to get what he perceived to be the metric that he wanted. Yes?
What was the longer-term impact of this particular leader? I mean, I don't know if you were around
Yes.
and saw this from a longitudinal standpoint, but the impact on morale, the impact on productivity, the impact on creativity, the impact on outcomes.
So the question is, what was the long-term impact for this organization and this office and their productivity? Over the next 14 months, their productivity went up substantially with high record numbers in the first 6 months after that first meeting. But not only was the staff reduced to 49, there was nearly 50% of the remaining staff that voluntarily quit and left. Meanwhile, in the first 6 months, productivity and the metrics were skyrocketing and upwards. And the larger organization for this company was extremely happy with what things were doing and how it was going. But then things began to break apart. And there were complaints. And the end result was after 14 months, that leader was dismissed for cause. And the entire offices were closed and is no longer in operation. So which brings up the idea for us to appreciate that fear is deceptive. Fear is deceptive when it's used as a strategy, and that was what was taking place in this particular organization. It was being used as an intentional strategy. I want the employees to be afraid. Because if I got them afraid enough, I can get them to do what I need them to do. So, does that sound like collaboration? Does that seem like team building? Is that an environment where people can grow and thrive? So, the truth is, as we see in the example that I'm sharing with you, that it can produce in short term a boost in productivity. And that some managers like that idea. They like that short-term burst. But it clearly will undermine long-term performance. And strategies that are sustainable are not sustained through fear, is what we come to understand. So here's a couple things we want to understand about fear. When it's externally imposed, as it was in the example that I'm giving you, when it's externally imposed, fear will either inhibit or cause an overreaction. There will be a reaction which leads to an overreaction eventually. But there is something about fear that can serve us well. Instead of when it coming from the outside, when it is acknowledged internally. When we as an individual acknowledge, I am afraid, it can produce a level of discomfort and frustration initially, but will later, almost immediate later, begin to serve in a positive way for the individual to correct or auto-correct and self-improve. Have you ever had an experience like that? Something that you were afraid to do, but you chose to do it. Maybe an action that you were afraid to take, but you took it. And as the result of it, the discomfort and maybe even the level of frustration that you felt actually worked for your benefit. Have you had such an experience?
It's healthy stress.
Healthy stress. Absolutely. So back in January, I decided I needed to be healthier. And so I began to make changes in my diet, my lifestyle, and something that I have never really done was to adopt a regimen of physical activity. And I was scared. And why was I scared? Because there's this mantra going off in my head that reminds me of my experiences in physical education class, PE class, back in junior high. Everybody's favorite school year is the 7th grade, right? And I still have that memory. In fact, there's a scene in the sitcom Frasier where this is kind of reenacted. And I remember seeing this scene going, I lived that. And it's the scene in the PE class where you have to climb up the rope, and standing around in a circle are all of your classmates watching you climb up the rope. You're not the first one to go because there have been others in front of you that climbed the rope and they did fine and rang the bell at the top and then came down. Now it's my turn to do this. And my fear in January was I can't do pull-ups because I couldn't do the rope. And I still remember standing no more than 6 inches off the ground because that is as high as I got up the rope. And that bell was 100 miles from my reach. And that was my perception. And so all of this is stirring up old feelings and emotions and ideas and thoughts. And that tape is just playing in my head, right? Because of the fear. But I recognized that this fear was inside of me. So it was not an externally imposed fear in January. It is now a fear that I have, and I'm internally acknowledging it, which created a frustration. And out of that frustration, I found a self-motivation to autocorrect and to self-improve. Now, you'll notice today I'm not doing a demonstration with a rope and Roderick climbing up the rope. We're not going to do that demonstration today because I'm not sure I would get much more than 6 inches off the ground still as I'm approaching my 60th birthday. But there are things that I am able to do that I wasn't able to do before January because I've been intentional and I've been practicing. What I'm doing is I am lowering my stress levels from being nearly full to mostly empty so that when there is a shaking, I'm not spilling over. Any questions, any comments about the myth of fear?
Congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you, Lou. I appreciate the applause there.
I share in it.
So let's talk about 3 kinds of fear. And this capsulizes not only a person's personal experience, but it can actually begin to help us appreciate the workplace. Because the workplace is not made up of the desks and the furniture and the chairs or the policies and the protocols. Yes, those are key elements that contribute to the work environment, including branding and vision and mission of the organization and doing what we do. But the workplace is largely made up and mostly influenced by human beings, people just like you and I. And so when we come to work, we bring ourselves. And there's this old adage of don't bring home to work, leave home at home. And then we flip that around, don't bring work home with you when you come home. And the idea here is that we leave in place personal things with personal life and we leave at work the work life. But in truth, here's the reality. If I left home at home, I would not be showing up at work because home environment, personal environment is also created by me, just like my work environment is created by me. And not me alone, but my relationships with others. So the moment I show up for work, I'm bringing home with me. And the moment I come home, I'm bringing work with me. Yes, there are appropriate boundaries we can discuss and talk about. But in fact, the idea of showing up means that everything that is a part of my life, part of my identity, part of my experience comes with me. That's not only true for me, it's true for you, and it's true for everyone that we work with and that we share life with. And so it's important for us to understand the stressors of fear and how we can begin to understand them. So there are basically three kinds of fear that emanate from stress. The first one we would call real fear. And if there is such thing as a good fear, this is it. Because when you and I are faced with real danger, our fear, which in turns we know scientifically triggers our sympathetic nervous system, and there are certain systems in our brain that begin to turn off because the energy in our brain is being redirected to other facets. We're moving from something that's much more reflective and cognitive to something that's much more reflexive and quick action. And it's motivated, it's triggered by real fear. And this enables us to preserve life, to preserve our own life, and to preserve the life of those that we care about and who we're working with and serving. And so if we imagine that we're driving down the road and someone cuts us off in traffic because they're not driving safe or erratic, we don't want to be thinking in the car in that moment going, now what should I do? Let me reflect for a moment so that I can be more informed and make a good decision. Because by the time we've reflected, somebody's hurt and possibly the life is not saved. And so our brain kicks in and we react. We react without thinking. Our foot quickly moves from the accelerator to the brake pedal. Our hands quickly move left or right in a way away from someone cutting us off, or maybe a child that's running out into the street chasing a ball and unaware of the approaching car. So the reaction is based upon a real fear because of the presence of real danger. We understand that. But now let's begin to compare that to the other two kinds of fear. There is the perceived fear, the inability to distinguish between experiences of then and now. So this is the individual who has had at least one exposure or one experience in their history that somehow their brain associates with an experience they're having currently in the present moment. And we would refer to this as an intrusion or as a trigger. So when an individual is triggered, it's often because they're perceiving threat in the present moment. This is not real danger, but their body, because it's aroused, their brain, because it's triggered, is reacting, and the reaction is less about what's going on in the present moment, and it's more about what happened in the history. That one experience, or in some cases, the multiple experiences. So depending on what I call the IDF, the intensity, the duration, or the frequency of past experiences, will determine oftentimes the reactivity and the behavior in the present moment because of perceived threat. And for these individuals, what is key for them achieving resiliency is being able to practice skills that help them, serve them to make distinctions between the then and the now. Does that make sense? Because when we can see the distinction and the difference, that was then, this is now. In the then, I was in danger and I reacted that way to save my life or to survive or to save someone else's life. But this is now, it's not the same situation. Might be some similarities, or there might feel like it's the same, but it isn't. So I reacted then, I don't need to react now because they're different. When we can see that distinction, when we can understand in our body that distinction, then we can step down from perceived threat. But when we're not able to do that, when an individual is not able to make that distinction, the past comes slamming up against us in the present. Largely because a part of our awareness is no longer fully here in the moment, we're somewhere in the past. And in that moment, we might be cognitively reliving the moment, but what is more likely to be happening much sooner is our body's autonomic nervous system is, on a sensory level, is reliving that moment and reacting to not the now, but the then. And then there's the third kind of fear, and this is imagined fear. And sometimes there's a confusion that perceived fear and imagined fear are two ways of talking about the same thing, but they're not. There's a real important distinction that we want to understand between perceived fear and imagined fear. For the individual that is experiencing an imagined fear is not necessarily because of something that happened in the past. It's not an inability to make a distinction between the then and the now. Rather, it's an inability or a failure of that individual to regulate their arousal system in the moment. And this can be influenced by a lot of factors. And I grew up in an environment that, because of religious beliefs, imagined demons in dark places. And I grew up with an imagination that was very wild and vivid, that carried over into my early adult life. And when I was alone in dark places, I imagined that there were things in the shadows staring at me. That's not real fear, because there are no things staring in the dark. It was not real. And I did not have a particular event in history that I was associating that with. But I was now imagining, because I was in a dark place and I was alone, and now I'm imagining. My body is becoming aroused, and the arousal of the body is creating the same reaction as if I had had a traumatic experience in the past, or if I was actually facing a bear in the forest or a snake on the trail that I'm hiking. The body reacts the same way. And so oftentimes what is critical for individuals with imagined fear is being able to become self-aware and self-reflective and self-accepting, so that we can begin to take intentional, purposeful actions for regulating our arousal. Again, the challenge here is not to stop the shaking, because the shaking is the norm. The idea here, rather than trying to stop or reduce the shaking, is to increase my ability that when the shaking takes place, I'm not reacting, or in some cases, overreacting. Any thoughts or questions about this?
So the first two seem like there's actual experiential things. The third one is there's no experience, and it almost seems like the third one's more created by the input of people around you.
It can be created by that input. So the question is, the first two fears seem to be wrapped around experiences, and where the third one is not so much an experience, but again, it's what's been imagined.
Thinking about this from a clinical standpoint, the reality testing that most of us would be doing in a situation like that in order to try to address the fear,
Yes.
or anxiety. Could you talk a little bit about how that ties into the regulation, the self-regulation?
Yes. So the question is being asked about assessing or evaluating the circumstance.
Because many of us would be saying, well, let's look at this. Have you experienced blah, 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 blah? Do you see this? If we were to turn the lights off here at this point in time, how would you experience it? Is there any real threat to you, et cetera, and we would stay in the reality of it.
Right.
But
So,
not address necessarily the other piece, and that's
Right.
where, yeah.
so the phrase you used a moment ago was, how do we do a reality check?
Yeah.
So that's a really important question, because how does a person who is imagining fear, imagining a threat that's not only not there, but it never was there, how does that individual do a reality check? Because their reality is what's led them to imagine the fear, to imagine the threat. And so this is where secure, stable relationships come into place. This is helping us to be informed of the value, not only in our personal life, but in the workplace, of having stable, consistent, predictable relationships with peers, with coworkers, who can help us to do the reality check. Which means creating partnerships of trust, which means having shared work experiences, which creates transparency, out of which comes trust. And it's not only about self-awareness and self-acceptance, it's about the openness we have in those relationships and the trust to receive that input and that assistance for a reality check.
So, which brings it back to creating a safe, secure, and predictable environment for people to come together, if you will.
Absolutely.
Meet the needs of the organization as well as, meet the needs of the organization.
Right. So something that all three of these have in common is the outer environment. So as a quick review from the science, the outer environment are the experiences and the exposures you and I have. It's what happens outside of us, and we experience those through our five senses. The inner environment is what kicks in the moment we have the exposure or the experience. The inner environment begins to assess, evaluate the reality check, if you will, at whatever level an individual is doing a reality check. So that inner environment creates a notion. And that notion or that judgment, that evaluation, that point of view is largely influenced from past learning. More specifically, past painful learning. Because again, and that's something else we learned in the science, is that as human beings, we tend to remember the negative more than we remember the positive. And that's not because we're broken, we're mentally ill, or that there's something wrong with us, or that we're bad. None of those things are true. Why do human beings tend to remember the negative more than the positive? Because we're human beings. And that's essential to survival. Now, I might remember the negative more than the positive. But because I have a prefrontal cortex, I can now go to the next level, provided I'm making it slow to make it smooth, provided I've given myself some margin, and I'm not in autopilot and a mad dash to get through something, but I give myself enough margin for my prefrontal cortex to be accessed. And from my prefrontal cortex, I have cognitive, I have language, I have intelligence, I have integrity, I have a moral code, I have logic and reasoning. And when these capacities of an individual are accessed, then it modifies our initial conception or our initial evaluation of what was just experienced in the outer environment. But for individuals and for workplaces that don't support that kind of self-reflection and self-evaluation, leads to an environment that's reactive. That's now no longer influenced largely because of reality, but influenced on past painful learning. In other words, we're all in survival mode. We're all following our survival instinct rather than our intelligence. That doesn't mean we're not intelligent. It means that in that moment we're not accessing that part of our brain in our experience. Again, if we're faced with real danger, the reactions are preserving life. And that accounts for a particular part of our experience as human beings. But real fear, real danger is not the larger issue in the workplace. It is not what's largely contributing to the demise of work relationships and the demise of an organization's vision and mission and the purpose for which they exist. What is undermining that more than anything else are the perceived and imagined fears. And so as we move through this information, it is again about how do we lower the threshold of stress? How do we reduce and regulate body arousal? How do we overcome compassion fatigue? And we do this with resiliency. So what is resiliency? Because it's been mischaracterized in a lot of places and in a lot of contexts. Resiliency is not bouncing back. So if you imagine, and I don't have a ball to do this demonstration, but if you imagine having a ball in your hand and you're going to bounce it off the wall, and you throw the ball against the wall, because the wall is stationary and because you're stationary, what is likely to happen is that the trajectory that you throw the ball against the wall is going to be the same trajectory for returning back to you. That's the bounce back. But in order to have a bounce back, we have to presume that the wall is stationary and not moving, and you are stationary and not moving. But the reality of life, personally and professionally, is that things are not stationary. Everything is in flux. The moment you have an experience or an exposure, you're already moving on. And the moment something happens to you, that origin of that happening or the person from which it came from is also moving on. The organization is moving on. This is why resiliency, professional resiliency in this context, is not bouncing back. Because now imagine you take the ball and you're on the flatbed car of a train and you're moving. And you're moving in this direction. Meanwhile, you're throwing the ball against a wall that just passed you by, or you're throwing it to a person who's going the other direction. If we even are able to throw the ball in such a way that that individual is able to catch the ball or hit it and bat it back towards you, it is no longer going to come back to you because you've moved on and they're moving in another direction. Even if we're going in the same direction, it's not likely we're 100% parallel. In other words, when things happen to us, for us to build resiliency is not the idea of bouncing back, because people don't have experiences of toxic stress and bounce back. What we do, though, is we learn how to work through it, which requires not only a commitment on our part as individuals, but it requires even more so a persistency. And the experience of working through difficult situations, working through perceived or imagined fear, we have to anticipate some resistance. Because the resistance will only be perceived or it will be imagined resistance. There will be, and the idea that I mean by resistance is that there will be some challenges and difficulties because the shaking is still going on, because the shaking is normal. So the shaking in some way creates a resistance. And resiliency is built when we persistently work through that resistance. And that resistance is not predictable. It's not regular. It's not necessarily consistent. It has a shifting and a flux in itself. So that broadens our understanding a bit more of what resiliency is. persistently working through shifting resistance, which becomes very difficult when you're doing it all by yourself, and becomes much more likely when we are doing it together, and it's not an us and them, but it's a we. And in the we, we're not only finding our own support that we need to do what we need to do, but we're providing the support that others need. And together, we are supporting what the organization can do. So, look at this idea from Joshua Hammond. A permanent comfort zone in which fear is never experienced is not conducive to personal growth. An environment totally devoid of crisis or challenge, or one in which risk-taking is discouraged, will not promote personal development or improvement. So essentially, what Hammond is talking about here is that not only is it important for us to recognize that the shaking is the normal part of our life and the normal part of the workplace, but in some ways the shaking is actually beneficial. And we want to look at how this is beneficial. So how do crises, because that's actually what we're talking about in the context of a workplace, what does the shaking actually look like? It's a crisis. And it's an organizational crisis. It's a challenge. And it provides risk. But the benefit of the organization is that we can grow through our people. But that's oftentimes not recognized. I remember being, several years ago, a part of an organization, a large organization. And the department that I was in, I was a lead in that department. And I remember going to a meeting, an all-staff meeting. It was an impromptu all-staff meeting, which that really creates a lot of faith and trust when there's a surprise all-staff meeting on a Thursday morning. And the CEO of the organization came to the front of the staff and said, I'm going to read a letter, and when I'm done, I'm not taking questions. Well, that's going to raise confidence right there, right? Everybody's feeling very safe in this moment. An impromptu all-staff meeting, CEO is going to read a letter and not take questions. And in the letter, he indicated that there was a crisis. 30 days ago, there was not a crisis, but now there is a crisis. And the crisis is we're upside down on our budget. And we're not at the end of the fiscal year. We're not at the beginning of the fiscal year. We're in the middle of the fiscal year. And 30 days ago, we didn't have a budget crisis, and now we do have a budget crisis. And so there will be layoffs, and 20 people will be let go today. And that was like at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. And by 1 o'clock that afternoon, not only myself, but my entire department was let go. The organization was facing a crisis. There was a shaking going on. And in that moment, because of how they perceived the reality, they did not recognize the sources and the solutions that rested in their own people. So here are 3 things that can really help us to understand this picture a bit more. How do crisis and challenge and risk benefit organizations? In other words, if we go back to Hammond's statement, how can the shaking, how can that level of discomfort actually be helpful for all of us? Well, one is the tools for correction and resolving the issues are within each employee. And if we go back to the original story that I shared where the office director, manager came before the 50 employees and said, in 60 days, there will only be 49 of you, and you get to decide who that is, who's intentionally using fear as a strategy, do you think that leader is recognizing that the deficiency that that office had had and the lack of productivity in the last 2 to 3 years that he was hired now to correct? Do you think he was recognizing that the solutions to those issues was inside everyone, including the one, whoever he or she might be, that would be let go in 60 days?
No. The typical top-down approach in terms of we come up with the problem, we come up with the solution, and the rest of you will implement as
Yeah.
you want.
The comment is a typical top-down approach. We have the answers. We'll tell you what the answers are. We'll tell you what the solutions are. These issues and seasons, because they can be in an organization, not just an issue, they can be a season, right? And sometimes the seasons are part of a cycle, and sometimes they're unique in some ways. But these issues and seasons serve as an impetus for open and honest relationships between coworkers, employees, and management, and with our clients. So if we think about this on a family level for a moment. I know we're talking about workplace, but let's draw an illustration for a moment from a common family context. We have a context where there's a husband and wife, and there are 4 children in the home. The oldest child, this child's birth father, is not the father of this house. In other words, this child was born from a previous relationship of the mother. But the man that she's married to now adopted this oldest child, and then they had 3 biological children between the 2 of them. So now there's 4 children in the house, and the oldest one is adopted. All 4 children share the same birth mom, but they have different fathers. Meanwhile, because of the toxicity and the history that mom has, she never wants to talk about her previous relationship. In fact, she has forbid everyone in the house to even mention this person's name. And so none of the children know the name because before they were born, this was what was expected. And then one day, when the oldest child is a young teenager, some distant family member who knows the history brings up that name. And it triggers a reaction from mom, and the child sees mom react, right? So how do we look at that situation and in light of this information? This is an issue, and the issue has become a season, a very long season, because mom feels safer if we don't talk about it. Meanwhile, by not talking about it, we're not only not disclosing to this young teenager their history and origin, but we're also not allowing them to participate in the evolution of their own story. Because mom has taken the position, this is my story, it's not my child's story, I'm going to protect my child. Now, if we take that experience and we look at it from an organizational point of view, oftentimes that's how organizational leaders look and consider their employees. I don't want to disclose to the employees what's going on because I don't want to create a panic. I don't want to create a fear. I don't want the employees to be hurt. I don't want them to be scared because they'll quit and leave. So we'll keep them in the dark. Which leads us back to the first point, that the tools for correcting and resolving these issues are within each employee.
There's a prejudgment, if you will, made that whether it's in the clinical vignette that you just described or in the organization, that there are different levels of reality depending upon where you sit within that organization or that family. And that the next level, the lower level, the child, if you will, isn't really going to fully understand or appreciate it. And it's almost a misnomer that they're trying to protect, as opposed to using it as an opportunity to really help everyone kind of understand what's impacting that unit.
Exactly.
And also have the opportunity to really come together and resolve some of those issues by using that prefrontal cortex and all those executive functions that exist there.
So let's reflect a moment on the family story. in terms of what we looked at in a previous slide on the 3 kinds of fear.
Right.
The fear the mom is experiencing right now, where she is forbidding anyone in the house to mention the name of the person she had a relationship previously. And that expectation is less on the children because they've never known, and it's more on her spouse and extended family and friends. Is she experiencing real fear? Is it perceived fear, or is it imagined fear? Perceived. Now, how would you assess the fear of the oldest child, who's a young teenager, watching mom react, but not having a context for understanding mom's negative reaction when the name was spoken in the house?
Depends, either real or imagined.
Well,
Depending upon how she's responding to
it could be. Any other ideas? Is it real, perceived, or imagined fear from the point of view of the child?
Imagined, because there's no experience that they've had. It's
Okay.
just kind of this fear that's kind of been created without a base because they don't know the story.
All right.
But there's a real trigger. The trigger is the mom's reaction.
And why is that a trigger for a child? A mom's reaction.
Because it's their baseline.
It's their baseline. And I would also argue that for a child, parents, particularly a birth parent in this case, is an anchor. So I want you to think about this concept now. We're going to shift from family back to the organization. Imagine the child is not the child, but the employee, and maybe a recent hire. And the parent is not a parent, but is a seasoned organizational leader. And from the employees, this young new hire employee's point of view, who oftentimes new employees come with an idealized point of view to the organization because they really are happy they've been hired because they made it through whatever levels of interviews and the decision was made and they won. If there was multiple people being considered, they got the job. And he or she is really thrilled to be there, and the initial days of hire is oftentimes very positive, and the new hire is gung-ho, if I can use that phrase. That may not be totally understood by everyone, but they're very energetic in a positive way for the organization. And they've just come through the onboarding, so they're familiar with the vision and mission, and they're giving their buy-in. And essentially, on a relational level, they're looking to organizational leaders as anchors. And for this new employee, there's a lot of changes. Things are in flux, perhaps in flux at home because maybe they've been unemployed for a while, or now they've got a new job and they're having to make adjustments to schedules. So there's some flux going on at home, as well as flux and the transition into their new role in the organization. So when anyone is experiencing a lot of change or a season of change, that's an experiences that can be very triggering in terms of stress and body arousal because there's a lot of unpredictable things happening or there's things happening for the first time. And it's going to take a while to get through this season and to find a sense of regularity and predictability. Meanwhile, what does every individual need when they're in a sea of change? They need an anchor. And they need that anchor to be largely unmovable. They need that anchor to be predictable because that's what's keeping them connected and not being lost or drowning in the sea of change. Can we see the picture? And when this new employee sees this anchor afraid or react in a way that seems to be afraid, insecure, a bit unstable, that reverberates that if my anchor is not stable, I'm not stable. If my anchor is not secure, I'm not secure. And I would argue that that is real fear. In other words, back to the family illustration, mom's perception of fear triggers real fear for the child, which is going to result in a sympathetic dominance if that is perpetuated, if that issue is unresolved. And what perpetuates that is we're not talking about it.